It's June 24th, 2026, and a clock started ticking 3 days ago that most people watching the news don't fully understand yet. On June 17th, President Trump and Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man killed in the opening strikes of this war, signed a memorandum of understanding. The Strait of Hormuz reopens, the US naval blockade lifts, and 60 days of negotiations begin on the one question this entire conflict was always really about: Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. What happens to it? Where it goes? And whether a deal to resolve it can actually be reached before the clock runs out? What I want to do today is something that nobody on cable news is doing with this 60-day window. I want to talk about what happens if the deal succeeds. I want to talk about what happens if it doesn't, because the failure scenarios are real, they are specific, and they are already being planned for. And understanding those scenarios is the only way to understand what is actually at stake in these negotiations. Drop your country in the comments right now. This conversation is genuinely global, and I want every perspective in it. This analysis is drawn from open source reporting, confirmed intelligence assessments, and publicly available strategic documents. Nothing here is speculation. Everything is on the record somewhere. My job is to connect it. Here is what we are covering today: the actual state of Iran's nuclear program right now, what the 60-day window is really trying to solve, and why the math is harder than any press conference will tell you. Then we go through the 3 specific collapse scenarios in order of likelihood, what each one looks like, what it triggers, and what the United States and its partners have positioned to respond with. Then we talk about the one factor that almost nobody is accounting for in these negotiations: the new supreme leader himself, a man who has not been seen in public since the war began, and whose actual position on the uranium is the variable that determines everything else. Then the global picture, what China, Russia, and the Houthis do if the window closes without a deal. And finally, the question that determines what this region looks like for the next 20 years. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, the 60-day clock is going to feel very different to you than it did at the start. Let's begin with the uranium, because you can't understand what's at stake in these 60 days without understanding exactly what Iran is sitting on right now. Iran holds 440 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 60% purity. I know you've heard that number before, but I want to walk through what it actually means in a way that the headline doesn't capture. The 2015 nuclear deal, the one that took years to negotiate across 6 world powers and was considered at the time one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of the modern era, capped Iran at 300 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 3.67%. Iran is currently holding 440 kilograms at 60%. That is not a comparable situation. Those are not numbers in the same universe. Here's why 60% matters specifically. The journey from natural uranium to a nuclear weapon has multiple stages. The hardest stage, the one that takes the most time, the most industrial infrastructure, and the most advanced centrifuge technology, is getting from 0 to 20%. Once you are at 20%, the remaining distance to weapons grade at 90% is technically far shorter. Once you are at 60%, you are, in the words of every technical assessment produced by every credible nuclear non-proliferation institution on Earth, a short technical step away from weapons-grade material. How short? Western intelligence agencies, as of March of this year, estimated Iran's breakout timeline, the time needed to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for one nuclear device, at 2 to 3 weeks. Using its IR-6 centrifuges at the Fordow facility, which survived the strikes with only 30% damage and whose core enrichment halls may still be intact, Iran could produce 25 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium, enough for one device, in approximately 14 days. That is not a year. That is not a decade. That is a 14-day window between a political decision in Tehran and enough weapons-grade material for a nuclear weapon. The IAEA has not been able to physically verify the location or status of that stockpile since June of last year. Iran kicked the inspectors out, the cameras went dark. Every number you are hearing right now, including the 440 kilograms, is based on measurements taken before the monitoring blackout began. What is actually sitting inside those tunnels at Isfahan today, and whether it has been moved or processed further, is something no outside authority can currently confirm. That is the specific problem the 60-day window is trying to solve. And that context is what makes the failure scenarios not hypothetical worst cases, but active planning contingencies that military and intelligence planners on both sides are working through in real time. Let's go through them. Collapse Scenario 1. Iran stalls, the clock expires, and nothing changes. This is the scenario the analysts call the Khamenei playbook, and it is the scenario with the most historical precedent. Iran has been through 6 rounds of international nuclear negotiations, going back to 2003. In every single one of those rounds, Iran's negotiating posture has been to run the clock, make incremental concessions on peripheral issues, and hold firm on the core question of enrichment sovereignty. What is different now is the severity of the military damage Iran has taken. What is not different is the strategic logic of the regime. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, took power as a wartime leader who has not been seen publicly since his father was killed in the opening strikes. His political legitimacy inside Iran depends on not being seen as the man who surrendered the nuclear program that his father spent decades building. Agreeing to eliminate or transfer the enriched uranium stockpile in the first 60 days of his rule is not just a technical concession. It is a foundational statement about what kind of leader he is and what kind of regime Iran becomes after this war. The domestic political pressure not to do this is enormous in a way that Western analysis tends to underestimate. If 60 days passes and Iran has offered cosmetic concessions, agreed to monitoring discussions, and kept the uranium in place, what happens? The U.S. naval blockade was lifted as part of the MOU. It does not automatically reinstate. Reimposing it requires a new decision, new diplomatic architecture, and the willingness to restart an economic confrontation that has already cost the global economy hundreds of billions of dollars in elevated energy prices. The Trump administration spent enormous political capital reaching the MOU. Going back to the blockade inside 60 days, if the Iranian side can make a credible argument that talks are still progressing, is not the automatic default it might appear to be on paper. This scenario is the one Iran is most likely actively planning for, not a dramatic collapse, a managed delay, a ceasefire that holds in form while the fundamental problem stays unresolved. Collapse scenario 2. Iran agrees to the deal but violates it. This is the scenario with the deepest historical resonance for American foreign policy, and you already know why. The comparison to the 2015 JCPOA is inescapable. That agreement capped Iran's enrichment at 3.67% and limited its stockpile to 300 kilograms. Iran complied on paper while simultaneously advancing its centrifuge program, improving its delivery systems, and using the sanctions relief to fund the proxy network in Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. When the deal collapsed in 2018, Iran was in a stronger position than when the deal was signed. The specific danger in a 2026 version of this scenario is the verification gap. The IAEA has no personnel inside Iran's nuclear facilities right now. All monitoring ceased on February 28th. Any agreement that the 60-day window produces requires Iran to allow inspectors back in before the uranium transfer or dilution can be verified. But here is the trap in that sequence. If Iran allows inspectors in and then delays on the actual transfer, every week of delay is a week of intelligence collection about where the material is and whether it has been moved. And if Iran's technical teams have been working to process the 60% material toward 90% during the period when the cameras were dark, the inspector's return reveals that progress to the US and Israel, which then triggers the very escalation Iran was trying to avoid. There is a version of this scenario where Iran signs the deal, allows limited IAEA access, and then discovers that the access itself has revealed how much further along their nuclear program actually is than the US previously knew. That discovery does not make a deal more likely. It makes a strike more likely, and a strike that happens because a deal revealed information rather than resolved it is politically far more complicated for the United States than a strike that happens because negotiations collapsed cleanly. Collapse scenario 3. Iran makes a move toward weapons grade and forces the issue. This is the scenario that intelligence planners call the breakout gambit, and it is the scenario where the 14-day breakout timeline becomes the entire crisis. The logic runs like this. Iran's position in the 60-day negotiations is weak. The blockade is lifted, removing the primary U.S. leverage. Iran's military infrastructure has been degraded. Its missile stockpile is depleted. Its leadership is new and unproven. In that position, one path forward is to use the 60-day window, not to negotiate a uranium transfer, but to enrich the existing stockpile further, not to actually build a weapon, to put enough near-weapons-grade material in a location that is declared and visible to make the question of a final strike politically impossible. The logic is this. If Iran can get to a position where it has 90% enriched uranium, sitting in a facility that any strike would risk dispersing as a contamination event, the calculus for military action changes. Not because a strike becomes impossible, because the argument about acceptable risk becomes much harder to make. Iran's strategic genius in the nuclear program has always been to stay just close, enough to the weapons threshold that crossing it looks expensive, and just far enough that crossing it looks unnecessary. A breakout gambit during the 60-day window is Iran trying to find that line again, after 100 days of war moved it dramatically. The response to this scenario has already been outlined. If Iran is detected moving toward weapons-grade enrichment, the paused ground mission from May, the one General Kane flew across the Atlantic to be briefed on, comes back off the shelf. And this time, it comes back without the diplomatic pressure to hold it, because the argument for waiting, that a deal is still possible, collapses the moment Iran makes an active weapons-grade enrichment move. That is the tripwire, and it is the reason the 60-day clock matters. not just as a diplomatic deadline, but as a military planning window. Now let's talk about the variable that the public analysis keeps getting wrong. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, was not a public figure before this war. He was known as his father's son, a religious figure with influence in the Revolutionary Guard's cultural networks, but not as a strategic decision-maker. His father was killed on February 28th. Mojtaba was elevated to supreme leader during wartime, without the normal clerical and political confirmation process that gives Iranian supreme leaders their institutional legitimacy. He has not appeared publicly since the war began. His approval was required for Iran to sign the MOU, and according to PBS reporting, that approval was given. But whether his signature on an MOU is the same thing as his willingness to surrender the uranium is not a question that any Western intelligence agency can answer with confidence. Here is why this matters more than anything else in the 60-day window. The supreme leader of Iran has absolute authority over the nuclear program. The military, the foreign ministry, the negotiating teams, all of them operate within the strategic framework that the supreme leader establishes. If Mojtaba Khamenei has concluded, in the closed environment of wartime Tehran, that giving up the uranium is existential for the regime, no negotiating team from either side can override that conclusion. The deal simply does not happen. Not because of a technical disagreement about verification timelines or stockpile disposal methods, because the person with final authority has decided it doesn't happen. The United States has no reliable intelligence picture of Mojtaba Khamenei's actual position because there is no public record of him taking one. His father's position was that uranium enrichment was non-negotiable, and that surrendering the program would be a capitulation. Whether the son holds the same position, or whether the experience of watching the war's destruction has moved him toward pragmatism, is the most consequential unknown and the most consequential 60 days in the history of Iranian diplomacy. What we do know is this: the MOU was signed, the Hormuz is reopening, Iran is at the table. None of that required the supreme leader to give up the uranium. It required him to agree to talk about giving up the uranium. Those are very different decisions, and the distance between them is exactly the inch that every analyst from Washington to Tel Aviv is currently measuring in real time. Now let's expand the frame, because if the window closes without a deal, the consequences do not stay inside Iran. China has been the primary customer for Iranian oil throughout this conflict, buying discounted crude through a shadow fleet of tankers that the U.S. naval blockade has made progressively harder to operate. A deal that removes the blockade permanently and restores Iran to global oil markets is a deal that removes the secondary pressure the United States has been using to make China's position in this conflict more expensive. A collapsed deal that reimposed the blockade is a deal that puts Chinese economic interests back in the crossfire of US-Iran tension. And China's response to that pressure is not passive. Beijing has been running unprecedented military operations near Taiwan, coinciding almost exactly with peak periods of American attention on Iran. More than 200 Chinese military aircraft entered Taiwan's air defense identification zone in May alone. The pattern has been consistent. Every time American ISR assets, carrier group positioning, and political attention shift toward the Gulf, Chinese activity near Taiwan increases. A collapsed 60-day window that pulls American military assets and attention back into Gulf operational posture is a window that Beijing will read, and has historically read, as a moment of expanded opportunity. Russia's calculation is similar, but simpler. Every week that the United States is managing an active military confrontation in the Middle East is a week that European political attention on Ukraine is fragmented. A deal that resolves the Iran crisis cleanly frees American diplomatic bandwidth for Eastern Europe. The collapsed deal that restarts military operations in the Gulf extends the period during which Russia can operate in Ukraine without the full weight of American strategic attention on that theater. The Houthis have already demonstrated their willingness to restart Red Sea operations. In June, they closed Yemeni airspace to commercial aircraft and threatened to resume attacks on Israeli-linked shipping. Their capacity to disrupt global trade flows through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is not dependent on the US-Iran deal. It is dependent on whether Iran's strategic posture signals that the confrontation continues. A collapsed 60-day window is the clearest signal they could receive that it does. Here is the honest summary of where this stands. The 60-day clock is not really a nuclear negotiation. It is a test of whether the damage that 100 days of war, a naval blockade, and the death of the original supreme leader produced is enough to change the fundamental strategic calculation of a regime that has held the same nuclear position for 30 years. Every prior attempt to change that calculation through diplomacy failed. The 2015 deal bought time, but did not change the calculation. It delayed enrichment without ending it. What is being attempted now is something that has never been achieved in the history of Iranian nuclear diplomacy. An agreement that actually removes the enriched uranium from Iran's possession or verifiably eliminates it inside Iran's borders. The three failure scenarios are not equally likely. The managed delay is the most probable near-term outcome. The verification trap is the most dangerous structural risk. The breakout gambit is the least likely but the most consequential, if it occurs. And the unknown quantity, sitting at the center of all three, is a new supreme leader, who nobody in the Western intelligence community has a clean read on. In a country that has just survived the most devastating military campaign in its modern history, making a decision about whether the thing that his father built and that his country bled for is worth giving away, in exchange for sanctions relief and a reconstruction fund. That is the actual weight on the negotiating table right now, not the text of the MOU, not the verification protocols. The question of whether the regime that survived this war believes it can survive without the nuclear card, and whether the answer to that question can be found in 60 days. What do you think? Does the 60-day window produce a real deal or a managed delay? And what do you think happens to the paused ground mission if it doesn't? Drop your country in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, subscribe. The 60 days started 3 days ago, and the story is going to move faster than any news cycle can keep up with.